Well, good morning, Radiant Church. I am so glad that you're here. Looking forward to this new series as we're getting ready to dive into it. I think it's going to be an amazing journey that we're on. I hope you're looking forward to it as well. Other things I'm looking forward to. Today, football season begins. Praise Jesus for that. My wife does not share those sentiments even slightly on that. But most importantly, I know some of you saying, well, it started Thursday night. And no, anything that starts with the Chiefs doesn't count on that. Yeah. Here, I'll get a yay in this crowd. Go Packers? Anybody out there? Oh my goodness. On that. Listen, it doesn't matter. Neither one of those teams matter. God's team is the Miami Dolphins, and that's just FYI on that. So, and you got to say, hey, I know you're a man of faith, because anybody that could be a Miami Dolphins fan for the past 30 years must be indeed a man of faith. So we're looking forward to that. Looking forward to this series as we talk about life after death. Is there life after death? And talking about even near-death experiences. And maybe this is a new topic. It's certainly an unusual one for us to talk about. And as I started today, I kind of want to just tell you, I was skeptical. I'm a skeptical person to begin with. It's just kind of how I'm wired. I don't always take things hook, line, and sinker. I tend to be a person who questions things along the way, especially when I hear stories like near-death experience, if I hear stories about the supernatural or the unexplainable things in life. I'm naturally skeptical, which for you might be thinking, well, that's kind of weird, because aren't you a pastor? I mean, don't you believe in the supernatural? I mean, Jason, the Bible is full of stories where there are miracles and there are all sorts of things going on in that story. Don't you believe in those things? And I have to just say, at Radiant Church, and you will always hear me say this, yes, the Bible is the Word of God. We don't compromise on that. We don't negotiate on that. Yes, I believe them. It's just that in my natural wiring, which is to be an engineer, my natural wiring causes me to question things, to kind of want to probe deeper, to ask, why did this happen? How did this happen? What occurred as a result of this? And so I'm skeptical by nature as a person, and maybe you are as well. And what I want you to know is this: it's okay to be skeptical. In this series, we're going to be dealing with a lot of stuff that is challenging. I'm not expecting you to believe every single thing you hear right as you hear it. This was a long journey of me walking through this, asking questions, wrestling with things, and I want you to wrestle with them as well. And so I'm not trying to sell you on anything or convince you of anything. I just want to present the data and the facts of this series, to tell you the stories of what people have seen, what they've heard, what they've experienced, and to challenge you during that journey to say, what does this mean for me? How then do I process this? How do I live? That's what this journey is all about, because like it or not, we all have one appointment in our life we're guaranteed to make. And the reality is this: we don't like talking about this one. It's dark. It's a difficult conversation. When we start talking about death, the reality that we all have an appointment with death, and we're guaranteed to make it. And the Bible backs this up completely, by the way. When we go to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, what does it tell us? It said, "It is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment." So we see, even the Bible corroborates that. It says, we all have an appointment with death. Now, where the road divides for many of us is on the second half of that verse. That part where it says, and then after that comes judgment. Not everybody lands there. And what we find in our society, in our culture, is that there's two different paths, kind of two streams of thought that most people land on. The first one is a Judeo-Christian understanding, and many other religions of the world as well too, that says there is life after death. But for a lot of people in our culture, especially in our rationalistic, humanistic culture that we live in, where reason and proof is what guides us in all that we do, most people believe in an idea that I call oblivion. This is an old Roman Latin word. And oblivion simply means this: you live, you die, that's all there is. You live, you die, that's it. You simply cease to exist. And for a lot of people, that's what they believe. Now, they may not think about it because one of the problems is this idea of death and what happens when we die. Most of us don't stop in our busy, hurried lives to think, hey, what happens? We don't think upon these things. It's a difficult subject, like I said, but I believe we need to think about it. I believe it's important. In fact, I will tell you, your kids are being taught this in school. Whether you believe it or not, they are being taught this in school. No teacher's going to get up there and say, hey, let me tell you about Oblivion, but it's the natural progression of the line of thought in which they are taught in school. You are one big cosmic accident. Nature rolled its dice through a series of long periods of times, through chance and mutations. You are here, and the animal kingdom grew out of that, and you are just one species within the animal kingdom, and what we know about the animal kingdom is you live, you die, that's all there is. We often joke, and we say this, we're like, I sent my kid to Rome and they became Roman. I don't understand it. Your kids are taught they're just one big cosmic accident. There's nothing beyond. And that's why we're struggling right now in many ways in our culture. We have raised up a generation on that belief. This idea of oblivion is not a new idea. It's been around for thousands of years. We can trace it all the way back to ancient Greece and some of the writings of someone named Epicurus. We see this in one of his letters. He says, accustom yourself to believing that death is nothing to us. For good and evil imply the capacity for sensation or feeling. And death is the privation of all sentience. That's a fancy way of saying you don't feel anymore. Therefore, a correct understanding that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable. Not by adding to life a limitless time, but by taking away the yearning after immortality. For life has no terrors for him who has thoroughly understood that there are no terrors for him in ceasing to live. You live, you die, that's all there is. That is what we're taught with oblivion. And it's still a modern idea, again, in our rationalistic, humanistic culture that we live in. It's taught. Just recently seeing in an article from a famous psychiatrist, David Noyce, in Psychology Today, he says this: I suspect that non-existence after death will be much like it was before birth, which I didn't find all that dissatisfying. In the marketplace of ideas, humanism is like the checkout aisle that doesn't offer candy. It might be less attractive to your inner child, but there are sensible and healthy reasons for choosing it. Theologians tell us that much about the afterlife is supposed to remain a mystery, but one suspects that this is simply a euphemistic way of conceding ignorance. So you can see there's two paths people typically land on out there. There's this idea of oblivion, you live, you die, that's all there is. Or they have to wrestle with the question, do you believe there's life after death? And that ultimately is why we're doing this study, and that's the question I want you to wrestle with. I want you to ask yourself that question. Do you believe in an afterlife? Do you believe that there is life after death? Because what we'll learn is if you believe there is, there are some huge ramifications to that on how we live and how we do life. And this is going to be an unusual series for us. I get it. We love, in many cases as a church, we love to dig into John chapter 15, the series we got out of, and just rip some verses apart, head into the Greek, compare that to other passages in Scripture, and so forth. We love to do that. We'll go through Romans 8, so forth. We love to just dig in. And by the way, I love those types of series too. Those are my favorites. But this series isn't going to be like that at all. Yes, of course, the Bible will be at the center of everything we do. Yes, we're going to go to the Bible to learn what does it have to say about heaven. You know, there's a lot of misconception, a lot of strange ideas out there about heaven. What does it have to say about the afterlife? What does it have to say about hell? our hope, all those things. Yes, we'll go there, but this isn't going to be taking a chapter or a set of verses and ripping them to pieces. And for those who really, truly enjoy that type of teaching, I need permission from you to let us dive into this topical series and struggle and wrestle with the question, is there life after death? Because I believe this question is incredibly important in the day and age that we live in, especially this year that we live in, where there's an enormous amount of fear, anxiety, all kinds of things going on that are giving us uncertainty. The only thing that is certain this year is uncertainty, and we're all kind of waiting to see what the surprise in September is, right? We're like, that's a new month, or something that's heading our way, right? On that, that's just the sort of year we're living in. And I think we need to wrestle with this idea in the church. What happens when you die? Do we need to walk around fearful of that? Is there a hope available to us? That's what I need us to do this series, and I need the church to just give us permission to go down this path. So let's dive in. My hope today is to just set the stage. This is going to be a 7-week journey for us as we go forward. We have a lot to talk about in this. My hope today is to just set the stage for the next 7 weeks, to build it up, hopefully to pique your interest a little bit and say, you know what, I think I want to learn a little bit more about that. I think I'd like to explore or wrestle with some of this stuff a little bit more. And that's awesome. But today I just want to set it up so that we have a foundation and a basis to move off of. So let's get started on that journey if we could. From a medical journal. It says, studies in the US and Germany have shown that approximately 4.2% of the population has reported an NDE. Now, we're going to see that those 3 letters, NDE, many times in the next 7 weeks, and it stands for near-death experience. So we see here that 4.2% of the population has reported a near-death experience. To put it in perspective, that's 1 out of every 25 people, or 13 million people in America. That's a lot. This is not a reporter. This is not a newspaper. This is medical journals reporting this. Another journal said this: near-death experiences are reported by about 17% of those who nearly die. NDEs have been reported by children, adults, scientists, physicians, priests, ministers, among the religious and atheists from countries throughout the world. In other words, this conversation is not a United States conversation. It's not a Western idea. It transcends race, culture, religion, and all of the things. It goes across the globe. We have stories from people on the other side of the globe. We have stories from Christians. We have stories from atheists. We have stories from Buddhists. We have stories from Muslims. And what's interesting, and we'll talk about here in a little bit, is there's a whole bunch of similarities they start to notice in these stories. What's even more exciting as we dig in over the next 7 weeks is to find out how many of these stories actually seem to match up what the Bible has to say. But this isn't just an American thing. As these stories began to show up in medical journals, and we're not talking about 2 or 3, thousands upon thousands of them were showing up in medical journals by respected doctors and researchers. One doctor in particular began to be suspicious. 20, 25 years ago, he began to look at him, and his name was Dr. Long, and he began to do his own research, even asking some of his own patients, did you have a near-death experience, collecting their stories and what they heard. And these stories over time began to change his life. What he started doing in order to disprove it began to change his life. In fact, at one point he said, these experiences have changed my views about life, death, God, and the world we live in. But one of the things we're going to do that's unusual in this series as well is we're going to be showing many personal testimonies and talking to these people so that you can get their perspective and learn from them. And this is one of those times. Watch this video with me as Dr. Long explains a little bit about what he's learned in the past 20 years with near-death experiences.
Some skeptics think it's impossible to study something that isn't a physical phenomena that you can visibly see and measure. However, I can assure people with those concerns that science broadly embraces subjective phenomena, and that's the entire fields, for example, of psychiatry, etc., subjective. qualitative, if you will, research, so it's very well established scientifically, very well validated, and very well accepted. A basic scientific principle is that what is real is consistently observed, and the overwhelming consistency of what's observed in near-death experiences strongly bespeaks their reality. The way I study near-death experiences, again with the best scientific methodology that seems to be published, is through a very, very detailed survey. There's over 100 questions that I ask. So in my over 4,000 near-death experiences I've studied, I'm not only getting a large number of near-death experiences, but we can look at them in a depth that was never possible before. Some people have wondered if near-death experiences are due to drugs or anesthetic agents. In having studied over 4,000 near-death experiences, the great majority of these people that had them were not taking any psychotropic, that is, brain-acting medication at the time of the experience. So there's no chance that drugs could account for what's observed in near-death experiences. Some skeptics have proposed that near-death experiences are due to hypoxia, which is low blood oxygen levels. Well, that's a reasonable hypothesis because, after all, at the time of a life-threatening event, typically you are going to have reduced oxygen levels in the blood as a result of the trauma or injury that led to that close brush with death. In any other altered type of human consciousness, dreams, hallucinations, psychotic events, you typically have confused sensorium. Experiences may skip around in dreams that are very common. You really have that hypo or decreased lucidity, and that's completely different in near-death experiences, which are hyper or increased lucid, tends to be very logically and ordered. I can't find a single skeptical explanation of near-death experience that any reasonable, well-informed person would accept as explaining near-death experience. One of the strongest lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experience is they shouldn't happen at all. At the time of a cardiac arrest, when your heart stops, well, of course, immediately, blood stops flowing to the brain. 10 to 20 seconds after that event, the EEG, electroencephalogram, which is a measure of brain electrical activity, goes absolutely flat. It should be impossible to have a lucid, organized experience at that time, and yet by the hundreds, people have reported near-death experiences immediately following a cardiac arrest, and that is medically inexplicable.
Listening to and talking about many stories throughout this entire series, because who better to hear it from than the people who experienced it or those who have been doing the research and learning from it. Some of these stories are going to be absolutely amazing. A couple years ago, an amazing story of a man who arrived in a coma at a hospital in Europe. At some point in the ER, he stopped breathing. His heart stopped beating. He died. And the doctors and the nurses, of course, rushed into his room and began to work on him, and they were trying to put a tube down his throat so that he could breathe. And one of the nurses noticed that he was wearing dentures, and so she grabbed the dentures and she put them in a crash cart drawer off to the side, and they did their thing. A week later, he awoke, and during that process, he asked for his dentures, if he could have his dentures, and the nurse says, "Honey, we don't know where they're at. We can't find them." And he goes, "Oh, just ask nurse such and such. She knows exactly where they're at." Being skeptical, of course, they went and they talked to the nurse, and she remembered taking them out, and they found the crash cart, looked in the drawer, and sure enough, there were the dentures. When they came back and asked, how could this be possible? He told them, "I was outside of my body on the roof looking down. I could hear the conversations you were having. I could see my body. I could see the procedures you were doing, and I watched you take my dentures out and put them in that drawer." How do you explain that? We're going to see stories like one from Dr. Neal. She's an orthopedic surgeon, trained to be skeptical about things like this. But she went on vacation and had a kayaking accident. But rather than me tell the story, why don't you watch this story with me as she tells what happened during that accident.
The boat and I were immediately and completely submerged under about 8 or 10 feet of water. I knew that I had been underwater already too long to still be alive. Then I felt my body break free from the boat, and it's as though I sort of shook off my shell of a body and my spirit rose up and out of the river. I saw my body being pulled to shore. I saw the guys start CPR, and I could look at my body and recognize that that was my body, that that represented my life here. And at that point, I completely surrendered the outcome to God's will. I was immediately greeted by a group of people, spirits, beings. They were absolutely exploding with a pure love. And I knew without any doubt that I had known them and loved them as long as I've existed. And then I was immediately and very physically held by Christ and reassured that everything would be fine. It was as though his hair, his eyes, his skin were all the colors simultaneously. My life was laid bare for all its good and bad. And Jesus was showing me this and saying, look at how that event impacted this person, that impacted that person, that impacted that person. And then we started down this exceptionally beautiful path to this great domed structure of sorts that I knew without doubt was the point of no return. I could have stayed there forever. But as we were going down the pathway, I was still able to hear the guys on the riverbank and see them. And one of the guys, who at the time was only 18, he kept calling to me to come back and take a breath. When I came back, I spent many, many months trying to find an alternative explanation for my experience. After going through every bit of research I could come up with, having looked at my medical records, corroborated as many details as I could about the scene at the river, I ultimately concluded that my experience was outside the realm of science and outside the realm of medicine.
These stories are not a new thing. They've been going on for some time. I mean, I came across an article just from 1982, and the New York Times said a Gallup poll reports that 8 million people have had near-death episodes, just like the one you heard now, just like some of the ones we're going to be talking about. This has been going on for some time. It's just that we haven't been talking about it. And so we're going to spend the next 7 weeks talking through some of these stories and learning from them. We're going to hear from children, innocent children who died, went to heaven, and what their stories were as they saw and described what they call heaven, and they describe a man that sure sounds like, and what they describe sure seems like Jesus as they describe him, and the love that they experience. But even more so, that several, not just one, several of these children came back and told their parents how they met their brothers and sisters in heaven. The problem is they didn't have any missing brothers or sisters. Turns out some of these were miscarriages or something else. And they found them in heaven, and they were there. What would this child have to gain from lying about that and what they told? And in most cases, the parents had to admit to the child, yes, you had a brother or sister, he died. Christy and I have had to walk through that, so we understand as well. One last story is of a woman named Maria. Maria died in the emergency room as well. They were able to bring her back, and the next day when she awoke, of course, to the amazement of her family, the doctors and the nurses, she was telling an amazing story of how she had left her body, and she could see them. They are working on her as she drifted up through the ceiling, and she went through the halls of the hospital, went to the outside of the hospital, and almost matter-of-factly, she stopped the story and says, oh, by the way, up on the top ceiling of the hospital, there's a pair of tennis shoes there, and she began to describe exactly what those tennis shoes looked like. She goes, somebody's probably looking for those. And of course, one of the nurses, being very skeptical, decided to go look on the roof, and sure enough, exactly where she said they were the exact shoes that she had described to them. And when they asked the doctors and nurses, they said she had never been up there before. You couldn't see that part of the roof from where her room was or from the road. The only explanation that she knew that those shoes were there is that she had indeed left her body, was looking down from above, and was in close proximity to understand the details. What do we do with stories like that? How do we explain those stories? And like I said, this isn't one or two. They have collected thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these stories in respected medical journals across the world. And this is what's caused even doctors who are skeptical, even researchers who maybe are atheists and don't believe, it still caused them to stop and say, something is going on here. We can't just ignore this. And one of the other things is they begin collecting those stories and they begin interviewing the people and learning more and more about these near-death experiences, is they began to understand there were some common things coming back. There were some things they were hearing over and over again in many of these stories. And they began to document what some of those things are. And we're going to talk about them this week, just an overview of them. But several of these for the next few weeks we're going to tear apart a little more and learn a little bit more about. But today, just to share with you, here's some common things they're hearing throughout these thousands upon thousands of near-death experiences from people all across the globe of many different races, many different religions, whatever it may be. What are some of those things we're seeing? Well, the first one is this: 76.2% say there's an intense and generally positive emotions or feelings. When they get to the other side, there's this positive emotion, intense feelings. Now, keep the 76% number in mind because it's going to come back again later on. But often what they describe is this incredible peace on the other side. 75.4% say that they have an out-of-body experience, much like we heard with the doctor in the kayak and some of these other stories, that they know they have left their bodies. Oftentimes looking at their bodies on a table or in a bed, they are aware they are no longer in their physical body. The third one, 74.4%, is that they have heightened senses. They are able to see things, hear things, experience things like they've never experienced them before, colors they've never seen before, all those things. Now, Pastor Ben's going to talk about this one next week, so I'm looking really forward to it, and I don't want to dive too much deeper into it, but just be aware. They come back and they say, I'm able to see and hear and touch and feel things I never felt before. And one of the things we're going to see story after story is that people come back and say there are no words. There is no words in the English language. There's no human words to describe what I experienced on the other side. 64.6% say they encountered a mystical or a brilliant light. And the Bible talks about that Jesus is the light of the world, and we're going to hear these descriptions, and over again, we're going to be like, that sure sounds like Jesus in there. And many people, in fact, came back realizing that's exactly who they met on the other side. He's there waiting for us. 60.5% say there's a sense of alteration of time and space. This is not unusual. Science and Einstein have been telling us about this for years. What we know about time is this: it's malleable. Einstein says it's the theory of relativity, right? We know that time is relative. And so what you'll find is people will say, it felt like I was gone for hours, if not even days, when I came back, when maybe they had only been dead for 20 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever it may be. What we learn is that time on the other side is not what we understand time to be on this side. 58.5% said they were aware of a decision to return. Not unusual, since the people we're talking to had a near-death experience and did return. The point I want to make here is this, though. That doesn't mean everybody got that choice, all right? It doesn't mean everybody that goes to the other side. These are the people who had the choice, came back, and we heard from them. But there's no indication everybody could. In fact, there's some indication from some of the stories that some people, their bodies were just in no condition to come back to, for instance. It was impossible for that to happen. 57.3% said they encountered other beings. They said they were either mystical beings, and in the Judeo-Christian background we have, we would understand what those are: angels. But you know what? We're going to dive in a little further in this series about what are angels, and come to find out we have a lot of misconceptions. A lot of even strange ideas over the centuries have kind of been put in beyond what the Bible says. And so we're going to look a little bit about who these angels are and what they're like. But they also said they experienced or met people that they knew, people that had been influential in their life. They recognized them, and other family members as well. And what we learn is God created us for relationships, and there will be relationships on the other side. As a result of encountering other beings, 56% came back learning special knowledge. We talked about the kids that went and understood that their parents had had other children and had lost children. There's all kinds of other stories where people went and they gained some kind of knowledge there, and the only way they could have gotten that is if they had been there. They learned something and they came back with it. 52% said they encountered unworldly heavenly realms. And we're going to talk about those heavenly realms in the coming weeks. We're going to talk about the city of God, the gates of heaven, what people saw, the fields of heaven, things like that. And again, just like we have some misconceptions of angels, there's a lot of misconceptions about heaven that we'll see as well. And it's going to be interesting to see how much their stories oftentimes align with what we understand in the Bible, and particularly the book of Revelations, as we look in there in the description of what they see. 33.8% say they passed into a tunnel. Now, it's quick for us because we have a saying in America that says there's light at the end of the tunnel, right? And we're quick to believe that at the end of that tunnel then must be this light that we're talking about in these heavenly realms we're talking about. But I asked you, I said, don't forget that 76% number that we saw up at the beginning. And the reason why is this. 24% of the people coming back spoke of a darkness and a hellish place you don't ever want to land in. And I get it. In our culture, we don't like to talk about hell. We don't think it's very PC. But know that 24% or more come back with stories of a very dark and dangerous place. And every single one of them come back screaming, don't go there, don't go there, don't go there. We're going to talk about that on one of the weeks as well, the other place. 31% encountered a boundary or barrier. They were just aware there was a point of no return. If I go past this point, go through this gate, there is no going back. And the last one is this. 24% came back saying they had a life review, just like the doctor talked about in the kayak accident, that they were shown their life like a film. And it's quick to think, oh, this must be judgment. And that's not what we're talking about. Every single one of them constantly wanted to say that they experienced Jesus, that they were shown this story, but yet they were in just incalculable mercy and grace and love. It wasn't shown to make them feel horrible. It was shown to help them understand there were times you were loving and there were times you weren't. There were things you thought that were important and there were things that weren't important. And constantly through that time in love and grace, they were asked questions like, what have you done with your life that you want to show me? Were you a loving person? Have you loved others as much as I am loving you right now? All questions that people came back reporting as they were shown their life. And there's just this idea that even when we get there, before we're to walk through the gates, there's some unfinished business we have to walk through. There's some hurts, some brokenness, some stuff we've got to work through for us to understand the enormous grace and love that we are being shown. We're going to talk about that one week, this idea of a life review. And I'm not going to give it away, but I want to tell you this just to warm you up. The stuff we think's important ain't important up there. They seem more concerned about how loving you were, more than anything else. Which gets us to our so what moment. Let's land the plane. Why are we studying this? We've talked about that a little bit. 3 quick reasons. Number one, we talked about a little bit earlier, and I just want to remind you. There's too many of these stories that are in medical journals by respected researchers and people. Too many of these stories to simply pretend they don't exist or ignore them. There's just too many of them. The second reason is this. The fact that people of various cultures and religions and races across the world have these similar stories, and that there are thousands upon thousands of them reported, leads me to one conclusion, and I'm hoping you wrestle with this conclusion as well. There is, in fact, life after death. There is. It is not you live, you die, and that's all there is. And because there are so many of these stories and we can't ignore them, and because we come to the conclusion that due to these stories there must be life after death, we're then forced to face one last question. How then shall we live? What do I do with the reality that there is life after death? So why are we doing this series? Because I want to bring an awareness out there that I believe wholeheartedly there is life after death. and that I believe that what you do here matters there. And if we understood that what we do here matters there, it would, in fact, change the way we live. C.S. Lewis had this to say in a book that radically changed my life called Mere Christianity. He said, if you read history, you will find that the Christians who did the most for the present world were those who thought most of the next. See, when we come to grips with the fact there is life after death, and we understand, like we did in John 15, that Jesus is calling us to understand that he is not of this world, and for those who believe we are not of this world either, we become heavenly minded. That means that every decision we make, everything we do, every word we say goes through the filter that I am a citizen, ambassador, and representative of the kingdom. That I am here for a purpose. I am here for a reason. What does it mean for us to be heavenly minded in our lives? And I get it. Jesus said on this earth it will be trouble. This is a hard place to live. I understand that as we learn more about heaven, we want to go there and we're like, why am I here? Why do I have to go through this? And Paul would remind us in Romans 8:18. He says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. So why are we doing this series? To remind you, in the middle of this crazy year, in all the busyness and all the chaos going on in your life, to cause us to pause long enough and think upon the life to come. To talk to your friends and your neighbors about it. To be reminded, as Paul did to the church in the first century, there is amazing hope through Jesus Christ. This is not futility. This is not you live, you die, and that's all there is. There is life after death. There is hope through Jesus Christ. You can have everlasting life. Your sins can be forgiven. That is good news. Amen, church? That's why we're doing this series, to remind the world there is hope through Jesus Christ. Not futility. Hope. But the last question I ask you is this. What if we lived now for the life to come? What if we were heavenly minded? What if every decision we made, everything we did, everything you said, went through the filter of, I am a citizen of heaven? How would that change how we live? Watch this last video with me that we wrap up with. And I hope as you see this video, you're reminded of the great hope through Jesus Christ. And I hope you're intrigued by this series, because I want to see you every single week as we begin to tackle some of these ideas. I think it's going to be pretty cool. Thanks.
When I went to the hospital, they gave me antibiotics, but it didn't work on me, and I became what you call septic. And everything in my body started shutting down. Once I realized I was dying, this peace and this joy and this comfort came all over me. I knew I was leaving my body. I went through the floors in the hospital, coming out into the atmosphere, and it was a blue sky. And I remember leaving the earth and seeing the solar system. I remember traveling really fast. There was a light before me. It looked like a window. And when I came into that realm, all I could think of was everything is right, nothing's wrong. It seemed like everything there was glad I was there. The trees were glad I was there. The flowers were glad I was there. The water was glad I was there. Some people say it was peaceful. I like to say it was past peace. I think the reason for that is there's nothing to be peaceful from, because I was in a realm that had nothing going wrong with it. I remember going up to the trees, and then the trees just started opening up for me. And there was a pathway that was laid before me. And so I started moving in that direction. It's almost like I was gliding, like on a people mover that you have in the airport or something like that. And as I went through the forest, it seemed like everything in the forest was saying to me, he's going to see the king. And when I got on the other side of the forest, that's when I saw Jesus Christ. He was real bright, brighter than any light I've ever seen, even the sun. And I remember looking into his eyes, thinking, he loves me so much. By the time I'm thinking of him loving me, it's old news, because he even loves me more. And then he looked at me again and he said, no, it's not your time. Go back. And I didn't want to leave. But I felt like he was saying, I need you there more than I need you here. And I remember how sad I felt. I felt like a newborn baby crying as I was leaving. And I remember coming in through the blackness again, back through the universe. I came through the hospital. I remember hovering over my body for a moment, seeing everybody move around in the hospital, and then I settled in to my body. They said I was clinically dead, which means your heart and your lungs are not operating. So in the sense of a skeptic, I always tell them, you may say I didn't go to heaven, but you can't say I didn't die because it didn't have any brainwave at that time. They can say I didn't go to heaven, but I died for an hour and 45 minutes. I went somewhere.